Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. It's been absolutely fantastic running away with the carnival, but it hasn't left me as much time as I'd like for my videos. Throughout the season, it'll come and go. And if anyone does a response video to me, of which I'm expecting one shortly, I will take the time, stay up late, do what it takes to script a response. Until then, most of my videos will probably be a little bit slapdash, and I might be dealing with some easier subject matter. To start, let's talk about common sense. Now, one of the reasons why I'm starting this channel is that as I've grown up, I've found that more and more concepts I believed to be basically infallible and universally accepted as I grew up. Things like freedom of speech, individualism, freedom of choice when it comes to your sexuality have been under attack from a variety of angles, and I wanted to defend them. One that I had not come across until after starting this channel was the attack on common sense. There are people out there who say that it's a bad idea, and give several arguments for doing so. I don't have them in front of me, or the definitions of common sense, but I'm going to do my best. Now, if you Google common sense definition, I'll be going off of the first 3 or 4, because they all say basically the same thing, which is that common sense is practical or common sense that you need in order to get around in the world. Basically, things that we all share in common that even many animals share with us. So, for example, if you're walking towards a fire and you've never seen fire before, you don't know what it is. You can feel as you get closer, especially to a large fire, that it is hot. Most animals and humans have the common sense of touch. And in its most literal sense, that's what common sense really is. Common sense is that we share and experience things in essentially the same way, meaning that the smarter the animal, the more likely they are to back away from a fire before they get burned, even the first time, before knowing what a fire is. Now, common sense gets overused a lot these days. Like many terms, it's come socially to take on multiple definitions, some of which are conflicting to a certain degree. And so people will try and use common sense from both sides of the political board. This is common sense, or gun laws, it's just common sense, whatever. This is patently ridiculous, because common sense are things that we can all essentially agree on because we all experience them in close to subjectively the same way. Ideas are very rarely, if ever, common sense. Feelings and emotions at times can be, by which I mean to say, fear of fire because fire is hot. So, what are some of the arguments against common sense? I saw one that it is not common, that most people these days lack common sense, and thus we shouldn't call it common sense. This is patently false. It comes from a misunderstanding of what common sense is, because common sense is by definition common. This person simply meant that politically and socially, things from a certain perspective seem to be falling apart. I don't believe that they are, but I can see where people say that they are. And so, since his personal political perspective isn't popular in the mainstream, it must mean that people lack common sense. Or it could simply mean that his politics might need a little bit of looking into. Or it could mean that politics, regardless of how simple or complex the subject, are very rarely, if ever, a matter of common sense. let's see here. What were some of the other arguments against it? I apologize. It's a beautiful evening, and I was taken in by the Ferris wheel for a moment. I do love this little pond. So, people also argue that common sense is a dangerous fallacy to fall into, that once you assume something is simple enough to be common sense, you'll just move past it without giving enough of an explanation to people who don't yet understand the concept. It goes back to an old math joke of a professor spends 10-15 minutes putting a problem up on the board and then says the rest of the proof is evidence. The rest of the proof is obvious. And the star pupil raises his hand and says, I don't get it, how is it obvious? And the teacher turns around, looks at the board for, a few minutes, walks back into his office, pokes around his books for a while, comes back out and went, yes, it's as I thought. The rest of the proof is obvious. Because once you know something, it's obvious. But before you know it, it can be impossible to understand. Once again, this is referring to math or to more complex subjects than things which are common senses. So people's arguments against the term seem to stem primarily, if not entirely, from the overuse and misdefinition of common sense in the social sense. This brings me back to a point that I've been hammering home a lot recently, which is that language is vitally important, that communicating with members of your basic society in a similar manner increases social cohesion, and that the less people can agree upon language, the more we're likely to see a breakdown of that fabric. This is one of the reasons why dictionaries are one of the cornerstones or core backbone fragments of our society. We need a common understanding of words in order to move forward with each other. And not just words, but commonly used phrases. Common sense is one where it's become more and more widely used for more and more things, to the point where many of the original definitions are now socially muddied by, just definition after definition after definition from different groups who believe that different things should be common sense. So the first step in making sure that you have common sense is discerning what is common sense and what is a complex subject to be discussed or debated. I mean, after all, it's just common sense. As for why it's important to have common sense, without at least some common senses, even if our senses are at least partially subjective, we just wouldn't have a way necessarily to communicate with or understand each other. See, in several different pieces of fiction, but primarily Lovecraft's work, like The Call of Cthulhu, they're being so foreign from our mental perception, from humans' perception, that they drive us insane just by coming into contact with them. That basically they exist so differently from how we do that just coming in contact with their existence is enough to drive people crazy. That's because they don't have very many, if any, common senses with humans. They exist in and perceive the world entirely differently than we do. On a smaller scale, and, to a less mentally destabilizing degree, you see the same thing happen when two people who come from completely different cultures and don't speak the same language meet. They have common senses when it comes to things like fire, and so there are certain things, even certain hand gestures, that will probably be understood and carry across simply because as humans we do all have these commonalities. But the less that you share in common, the harder it is to communicate with or understand one another. Now, I think it's important that we do our best to understand different cultures and really everyone as individuals. But in order to do so, we need a starting point from which we can all move forward. And if we're being realistic, the best starting point for all of us is common sense, the things that all humans share and can work off of as a foundation. But hey, that's just my take. I might do another video or two on the subject of common sense. I'd like to do a scripted one. There's actually a lot to say on the subject, but for most of my viewers, you're probably thinking, why was this video needed? This is, well, common sense. And I was surprised to find out that there's as much of an argument going on against common sense and against the use of it as there is, but it's out there, and I expect to see more. Anyway, thanks for joining. As always, I'm your host, Lewis Cipher, and thank you very much for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Please remember to like and subscribe. Ciao.